All right, so today again, we are going to be focusing on the unit 6 of patterns biology, which is matter, energy, and climate change. What we have linked for you here on this slide are both the distance learning unit outline and the in-person learning unit outline. But last year, as you know, we went into our emergency educational intervention in March, and many people, including me, didn't teach Unit 6 at all. So what's listed there as the normal unit outline, the in-person unit outline, actually hasn't been updated or touched in 2 years, because the last time it was taught was 2 school years ago. Last year, it wasn't part of what most people did. So, and I didn't touch it at all. So just to be aware, some of you may be in person with some students, and maybe you have the ability to try the algae project, for example. That is in the normal or in-person distance learning, or excuse me, normal. It's all confusing, all the wording. If you are in person with students, it might be worth your time to take a look at the normal unit plan, because there are some in-person lab type ideas that may be working for you, but the focus of this webinar will be the distance learning materials. Many, if not all of you, have taken an in-depth summer course. Some of you have taken it more than once about the patterns curriculum, but in case there are some of you who have not, I just want to put a point out for the principles upon which the patterns curriculum is designed. We call these the design principles, and there are 2 links there, one of which is a longer explanatory description of the design principles, and the other one is a shorter 2-pager. We'll be looking at one of these design principles in depth towards the end of the webinar to show you how this particular unit addresses that design principle, but we really try to hit all the design principles in every unit. But of course, in this webinar, we won't have time to discuss the in-depth on each one of those. So that's for your reference, access to those design principle descriptions. So the unit essential question in this revamped unit is, how does the changing climate impact Earth's ecosystems and the cycling of carbon? So 2 major issues here: climate change and carbon cycle. There are lots of NGSS standards around these 2 topics, and we're going to I'll discuss with you which standards go with which activities. It is important for us to keep in mind that one of the design principles is that we want to keep things as much as possible place-based, and so you'll notice that the data and the information that students are going to be seeing in this is really based on things happening in the Pacific Northwest. So you'll be seeing obviously what students will be seeing is information that hopefully is local or relatable for them. A little disclaimer though, this unit is brand new. It's basically, the patterns biology team has been working on this unit for about 2 months, but none of us have taught it yet, right? I will be starting it on the 19th, like right after the long weekend, and 1 more week to finish up evolution, and I'll be starting on the 19th. There are going to be modifications. Hopefully those modifications will be minor. We've done the best job that we can in putting together the materials for students, but there are probably going to be typos. There are probably going to be things that got missed, but hopefully those will be caught quickly and fixed. Some of the support materials are still in progress. So the interactive notebook, for example, isn't done yet. And if you're using the public Canvas shell that we put up on the Canvas Commons, that's also not done. But I have to finish those this week because I will be starting it a week from Tuesday. In addition to that, it's been a little bit more challenging because my counterpart, Jessie Chamberlain, who some of you know, just had a baby on December 24th. So she'll be out on parental leave until the beginning of 2nd semester. So where normally we would be splitting this work, I'm doing it all to get ready to teach it. So those materials are coming, but they were not able to be finished before today. So that's why they're not linked on the unit plan. Yes, congrats to Jessie. She had for her firstborn, a little boy, Cade. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump in. There are 5 task sets in this unit. Some are a little bit longer than others. The ones sort of closer to the end are a little bit longer. So we're going to kind of go a little more quickly through the first several. So if you're familiar with patterns biology and have used materials before, you know that the first task set is really often presentation of some data, asking students to look at the data, look at the phenomenon, and find out what they're thinking and what they're wondering, to kind of have them do the practice of asking questions. So what we've put together for this unit, or for this unit opener, is a series of graphs, maps, and images about the effects of climate change. And this includes images of things like the thawing of permafrost and the effects of that, the temperature changes. Well, obviously we start out with temperature changes. This is actually a little video that shows with a scale a Robinson projection of temperature changes over time. We can kind of see it goes from 19, and then it has several time frames. And then we have, so for example, thawing of permafrost, number of forest fires. It's a pretty dramatic picture. This actually came from the New York Times did some really excellent coverage of the fires in the West last summer. And so several of these fire-related images come from the New York Times. Pretty dramatic graph right there. This is just numbers of fires or fire detections. Here is a map that shows, again from the New York Times, that shows area within Washington, Oregon, and California. The gray represents fires over a 20-year period, and the orange represents the fires in 2020. So it's not just a question of how many fires, but the size of each one, and cumulative fire affected areas over that 20-year period. We also have a animated video. Let me see if I can play it for you. There it goes, an animated video that it loops, and this shows, this is actually from satellite images of the smoke from the fires. So if you take a look sort of up here in the Oregon part, you can see that Beachy Creek fire and those other fires that were burning around the same time. It's pretty dramatic. And this is on a loop. This also came from the New York Times. They analyzed data from NOAA. So what students will be doing as they're watching all of these is answering some of the questions, or answering the questions that are embedded in these slides, and recording in their INB or in their activity guide, what is it that they're seeing there? What are they wondering based on what they're seeing? Just to do some initial reflection. So drought, of course, is another effect of climate change. So we have some data about drought from 2018, and then combining higher temperature and drought, of course, increases the potential for wildfire. So this actually comes and helps students get to our major phenomenon, which of course is that wildfire is being worsened, or wildfire risk is being worsened by climate change. And then we thought this was also an interesting thing. This is actually an effect on bird abundance at different latitudes. So this is a little bit of a harder graph to read, but it shows that birds actually are moving farther and farther north than they had in the past, presumably because of temperature changes happening in their normal habitat. That this is an interesting thing that came from the National Audubon Society. It's about 5 years old, these data, but still pretty dramatic shift in what bird populations are doing. So we're coming back here to the unit essential question, right? How does the changing climate impact all of Earth's ecosystems, right? So trying to see in that series of introductory images and graphs some of the impacts that have occurred. All right. So in task set two is focused on the carbon cycle. And in this task set, students are using a simulator that comes from Annenberg Learning. You may have heard of Annenberg. They are the ones who are pretty famously, about 20 years ago, did a video where they interviewed Harvard graduates about where the mass of a tree comes from. And like something like 18 out of 20 Harvard graduates were unable to give the accurate answer that the mass of the tree comes from carbon dioxide. And so that's Annenberg they've always been around there, and it's a foundation in California, but they have a simulator about the carbon cycle, and it's not a very in-depth one, but we also knew that when we were developing this, that we didn't want students to get bogged down in too many details, because we knew that the unit needed to be on the shorter side. So there are two parts to this task where they engage with this carbon cycle simulation. First of all, they're kind of looking at carbon sinks and sources and seeing where, as time goes by, how carbon moves around to those different sinks. And then the second part is there's a graph incorporated into the simulator. Actually, let me go ahead and click on that to just give you a quick idea. Let's see if I can get in there. There's a graph, and the graph actually shows atmospheric carbon dioxide. You can see this graph, the graph here. It shows atmospheric carbon dioxide projections, and students are able to adjust some parameters, not anything super, excuse me, super difficult, but looking at fossil fuels usage and deforestation. Those are the only two variables that they can change. And then they have to, in the second part of the activity, they have to try and figure out how to keep this curve underneath the goal limit. So they have to modify the fossil fuel usage annually or deforestation in order to be able to make sure that the green line, as they, sorry, you can't see this, they can actually click on run decade and it will actually move. And so they have to figure out how to keep that line underneath the goal limit. Now that goal limit's actually way higher. It's marked at 550 parts per million carbon dioxide, which actually would correspond to a 3 degrees Celsius change, which we all know would be catastrophic. Paris Accords asks or requested, or they're trying to get, say, at a 1.5 degree change. So we're trying to get students to think about how to keep things under 450 parts per million, which is what the recommendation from Paris Accord is. So we had a question in the chat. So Stacy, what you'll see as you look in the activities, what she asked, what kind of ideas do we present prior, or do we for carbon cycling? This is it. Like, this is what I will be planning to do. So for example, over here on the right-hand side, you can see that there's this carbon cycle simulator, and as they run through it, and it's kind of written into the activity that they're just playing around with it at first to see where the sinks are and how, as time goes by with certain settings, that they would that those sinks actually change over time. So this would be the introductory, and then the second part is, well, what's the implication of that? So in addition, in this task set, there's also an option to do a photosynthesis lab. Traditionally, we would, of course, I like to do a lab where we're watching seed germination in jars in a closed system to show the mass changes inside, or no mass change, I should say. I can't get that thing to go away. There we go. So there is a photosynthesis inquiry option that is 100% virtual. We have a computer science teacher in our district who actually rewrote there was an online simulation, I guess, for a long time from one of the book publishers, and it's now no longer available. But the computer science teacher rewrote that. It's not beautiful, but it works. So it allows students to change carbon dioxide concentration, light wavelength, and sorry, what's the other major one? totally blanking right now. The other thing that has it, oh, intensity of light, there we go. That actually will change the rate of photosynthesis. And so they count virtual bubbles on a virtual LEDA plant. So it's not beautiful, but it works for that concept. But that is the only part of the carbon cycle, like technically, that is being pushed in this task set. There's just not time to do all of those other things, talking about weathering and respiration in detail and all of those things. Respiration does come up earlier in unit 2 and when doing biomolecules. So, and especially during distance learning, we just all have to give ourselves a little bit of grace. There is no way that we can cover all the material to the depth perhaps that we may have done before. And in addition, in our patterns sequence, we are prioritizing student talk, the practices of science, and the cross-cutting concepts. We can no longer spend 100% of our time forcing content. So we have to really make we as teachers, all of us, absolutely, Christine, you're right. It's really hard to do that in regular school too, absolutely. And so I like to think, and if you know Bradford Hill, who started patterns in physics, he has this idea, he says, well, we have to keep our eye on the prize. What are the really most important pieces of information here that students really need to know? Because if for some of our students, I'll speak for myself, I might be the last science teacher they ever have in their life. What do I want students to know about? Do I want them to know about that plants are really helpful to combat climate change? Yes, yes, I do. I want them to know that. And do I want them to have the bigger picture of, well, what happens when we burn oil and gas and coal? Well, all that, guess what? That all goes right into the atmosphere, and that makes it even more difficult. So for me, those are the two prizes, right, that I want students to be able to get out of this unit. It's not as important to me that they know how glucose gets broken down by cells. In this it doesn't fit, and plus that doesn't fit in this context. So they followed that up then with a short article about forests as carbon sinks. And I realized I forgot to put it on this slide, but in the task set, there's also an option for an assessment at this point. I don't know if any of you are familiar with data nuggets, but data nuggets are a really amazing resource for some authentic data analysis assessment opportunities. And we took one of those data nuggets and just converted it into a Google Doc for students to be able to use. And we added a few different questions. The data nuggets are great because they take real data from real scientists all over the country and you can search their database and find all of their different ones that they have. Data nuggets, I think it's datanuggets.org. I think that's right. You can click on that and take a look. But we pulled one of their sets of data and narrative and can turn that into an assessment around carbon sinks, specifically forests as carbon sinks. All right. Along the same lines of not being able to cover everything, we have made some decisions about which NGSS targets are kind of higher priority than others. So carbon cycling is maybe highest priority, and coevolution, which is this ESS standard, is maybe not as high a priority. And so there is a coevolution task that's written in this unit. It has to do with the geological history of oxygen gas, and it comes from HHMI Biointeractive. So it uses their biointeractive resource and has students analyzing a graph about when oxygen became present in Earth systems, and it aligns with the appearance of algae. So students really come to realize through this task set that algae are responsible for oxygen being present in Earth systems. It really ties in very well in the in-person unit when we then follow with the algae project. In this case, I will probably not have time to do this task set, but it is there in the unit planner, and you can decide whether it will work in your setting. All right, so I sped through the first three because 4 and 5 are kind of heavier. It might take a little longer to describe. So if you've come to some of the earlier webinars, you're aware, and whether you've come to the webinars or not, you're probably aware of the new Oregon requirement for tribal history, shared history. And there are three, if you're not familiar with that, sometimes it's also called SB 13, but SB has to do with Senate bill. And since it passed, it's no longer a bill. So it's called the Tribal History, Shared History Program. And at Oregon Department of Education, they worked with the 9 federally recognized tribes to write lessons in a variety of areas: English language arts, mathematics, social studies, and science at different grade levels. So there are 3 science lessons, and 2 of them really fit more with biology, and 1 of them fits more with chemistry. So just if you teach chemistry, also just be aware that the Chemistry Council is working on incorporating that 3rd lesson into the patterns chemistry curriculum. And then we in biology have taken on the other 2. So the first one about native food sources really fits in more with our unit 4 on genomics. And then this one is about land management and fits really more in this unit. So this lesson is almost exclusively from the materials that came from ODE that have been published by them. It actually has videos of Native voices on a variety of topics, and incorporate historical information about how tribes have been managing their lands in Oregon since time immemorial. And so there are 2 parts. First part is where the students learn about the history through the voices of the Native peoples, about a variety of topics in history. Manifest destiny, the push of colonial power to their colonization towards the West, how resources were extracted from those areas, things about treaties, and then also how the tribes have worked to restore their ecosystems that have been on lands that have been returned to them. And then the second part is where students actually have an opportunity to investigate 4 different tribes or groups of tribes that have projects currently in the works about land management and land restoration. And so the way that it has been worked in for distance learning is that we've suggested that a class gets broken up into 4 groups. Each group investigates one of the projects, and then they share through a jigsaw format of your choosing. They share so that all of the students then get information about all of the projects. And they identify what the goals of the project are, what the impacts are on the tribes themselves, what the impacts are on the land, and the importance also of outside partnerships to the tribes in these processes. Now, if you're new to tribal history, shared history materials, or implementation of those lessons, as a white woman coming from the East, having been educated in the 80s, I got none of this information. So for me, it was really essential to read these documents that I've linked down here at the bottom of the slide. They're also linked in the unit planner. There are 2 documents that are provided by ODE. One of them is called Approaches in Indigenous Education, and the other one is Critical Orientations for Indigenous Studies Curriculum. I found both of those documents to be very helpful for me in preparing to teach these units, or these lessons within the units, because I quickly came to realize that my knowledge in these areas was severely lacking, especially no context from having grown up in the West. So. All right. And then that links us that it's actually a perfect fit for this unit, because since that task set number 4 talks about how the tribes have managed their land forever and ever, we're able to give students then the opportunity to do some comparing and contrasting about forest management practices and to evaluate which kinds of forest management practices might be best for helping to mitigate the effects of climate change moving forward. This task set could take a few days, and there are several parts. So depending on your time frame and your situation in your classes, you may choose to do some or all of this. So the first part is that students interact with more data and history about forests, including some information about cultural burning and when fire historically was used by indigenous peoples. One thing I learned, for example, is that governmental management has a lot of rules in it about the fires, prescribed burns must happen at a certain time, like by a date or by the first frost or by whatever, some numerical decisions, numerical based decisions. Whereas indigenous fire management looked at things that happened naturally. For example, burning happened when the acorns fell from the trees. Excuse me. So that's just one example of some information that students are learning and seeing in this task set. And so that's the first part. They get to interact with some information, videos, articles. We pulled a lot. We have in Beaverton, we're very fortunate. We have an American Indian and Native Alaskan resource person, a person who is a member of an indigenous group. And he helped us collect information and resources for this set of tasks. So this has not just been developed by white people like me. We have really searched out or we have seeked out help from people who know. So let me have us take a quick look at this student document of what students are actually going to be doing in this task set. And again, it is, we should close this up. Whoop. There we go. So they watch a video about cultural burning, write down some notes about that, and they are able to compare and contrast tribal management practices and US government or Forest Service practices. And then again, students have the opportunity to investigate different tasks. Let me zoom in on this a little bit so it's a little easier to see. So we have several different articles. Some of them are articles, some of them are, we have podcasts and videos, so a variety of different types of media. And students in their small group might each of them read 2 of these things or interact with 2 of the sets of data. And then they share the information that they pulled out from that and identify the impacts of the practices on ecosystems and on humans. So some of them are, if we go back to the list here, so we have all of these are about native land management and fire management. So that's the first part. And then the second part, which is relatively short, the National Park Service has actually put together a timeline, a visual timeline with a map. We can actually take a quick look at it, where it automatically goes through history and shows, sorry, it's loading here. So in each section, there's a historical part on the left, and then a map on the right. And so it automatically moves forward. So it describes sort of how over history, the US government changed the structures that it had in place in terms of fire management. So I think because I'm running Zoom right now, the map isn't loading very quickly. And so it's a little bit hard to have enough time to read what's in the column as well as see the map at the same time. But what's in the text is really most important and then it actually just zooms in on like where on the North American continent the event occurred. So you have things like John Muir, for example, and then the establishment of the national park and national forest system, wildland fire control, these kinds of things. So one of the things, thanks Kim for your comments. One of the things I think that's really important in this process and that I have learned in working with the Biology Council and on this curriculum for now quite a few years is there are lots of really amazing things out there. And I think that we were a little bit conditioned, especially those of us who have been doing this job for, close to 20 years or maybe more. We were all conditioned that the textbook was the thing, right? And now there's so many resources that are out there that have really such amazing information. And I think that if we just expand our minds a little bit and think about how we're delivering instruction and what kind of instruction and what kind of resources we're using, we can give students that just a much wider range of knowledge and more of a basis upon which to sort of make some bigger jumps as they, after they leave us. Okay, moving on. So then we have contemporary fire management. So recently, I think it was in November, Ira Flato of Science Friday did a interview with a journalist and with some native fire managers in California about the interaction of native fire management and also racism as it applies to interactions with Native peoples. It's a 17-minute podcast. I may actually just play it for my whole class. I don't want to say sacrifice my lifetime, but I may take 17 minutes of my lifetime for everybody to listen to this together. It is really powerful. And then we have another article here, or I should say we have an article to add here that talks about the transfer back of public lands being returned to the tribes. Now, I can't remember exactly where it is, which article it is in, but it's in the slides. I learned, for example, that the Klamath tribes in Oregon were one of the first tribes to be terminated in US history. And the Klamath tribes are also one of the only tribes that was never provided any land back. And so in 2015, there was an agreement made between the Forest Service and the Klamath tribes to return some management rights of a certain part of their historical lands east of Klamath Lake for the tribe to manage. But of course, it's a much, much, much smaller section of land than, something like 8 or 10% of the historical area that was managed by those tribes. So there is a movement towards the return of some of these public lands back to management by tribes. There is some movement towards that, and we want students to see what's happening there and the effects. And then last bit, and this is the part that will take I think a long time for students. This is the sort of the assessment, the writing task part, right? We're asking them to develop an argument with some supports. We have a resource sheet for argumentative writing that students can access. It has sentence framing and kind of guidance about what would be included in an argumentative piece. Actually, those parts are also written here on the left-hand column. And the students are going to be answering the essential question, which I'm just going to scoot back up here to the, actually it goes back to our task set question. What forest management practices most effectively mitigate the threats of forest fires? And so they will use as evidence all of the notes they've taken, the readings or podcasts or videos that they've watched, and incorporate those ideas into their argumentative writing piece. And there are lots of other ways that you can that you can have them do that. They could do a speech. They could record themselves on a video. They don't necessarily have to do it in writing. I think I'm going to provide those options for my students that they can, write down notes and, read it or talk to me about it or do a video or whatever. Lots of options there, especially during distance learning. Not every kid is, really intent on writing an essay. So provide some options there. So I mentioned at the beginning that we wanted to take a look at one of the design principles in depth. Yeah, Flipgrid's great. Again, one of those things that, sorry to interrupt myself. Thanks, Christina, for your comment. We have, I don't know if other districts are doing this, but in Beaverton, there's been a big lockdown on what kinds of technology we're able to use as a result of agreement or non-agreement to student privacy. There's a student privacy document that Beaverton School District is requiring that outside organizations sign. And those are some great ideas, but sadly, we're not able to use them. And since we can't, we're trying to provide something that is usable in its existing form anywhere. But I mean, those are great resources. I just wish that we could use them. Let's see, are there any avenues to connect back to the carbon cycle in the atmosphere being a small sink compared to oceans and forests? We haven't incorporated that, but I think that I would definitely take some screenshots of different settings on that simulator and incorporate them back into the slides to say, hey, remember this, right? What's happening here? And Stacy, I would not be surprised if, I may be among the first, well, we'll see, but look for those additions. I'm guessing I'm probably going to add those in. I stick photosynthesis at the beginning, but we did not focus on respiration because outside of the carbon cycle, Laura, because I think we just had to make a decision that some things had to go, and we were kind of thinking like, the photosynthesis is obviously much more connected to this phenomenon than respiration is. Not talking as much about that, but it is incorporated into the carbon cycle simulator that all the terrestrial living beings, the biosphere is incorporated into that. Let's see. Okay, so when we're developing a unit, we want to be able to incorporate as many of the design principles as possible, but I think I would have been remiss here to not focus on culturally responsive as the design principle to think most deeply about for this unit. Some of you are maybe familiar with this diagram. Obviously, you know about the three-dimensional education in terms of the practices and the concepts, as well as disciplinary core ideas. But there is a growing movement of people who believe that we actually need 5D learning, incorporating also student interest and identity. And so we have to actually incorporate all of those things to have meaningful learning, right, for students. And so when we design culturally responsive curriculum, we're actually doing that, incorporating interest and identity into our science. So we have identified several components of culturally responsive teaching in the design principles, and you can see them here. But specifically, I want us to think a little bit about how social and environmental justice concepts can help students actually think more deeply about where their science knowledge is and how they can build from there. So let's just take a look at the question, and I'm just going to give you about a minute to think about that, and then we can have an opportunity to share. So the question is this: how can questions of social and environmental justice be used effectively to help students deepen their desire and ability to build their capital of scientific knowledge? So just take a brief moment to think on that. Good. So Laura shared in the chat that many students are interested in social justice issues, and if we frame scientific concepts around them, then it helps students see how relevant they are. Yeah, connecting to current events that they're seeing in the news, absolutely. Looking locally, especially with fires and the impacts on human health, right? I mean, I took pictures of my air filter before and after, like after one, I changed my air filter, and just to see what that's like. Other thoughts?
One thing I'm thinking about is like policy decision making, and how even though we know so much about climate change based in scientific evidence, that decisions, especially in our country, are not typically made that way. So I just kind of the disconnect between making decisions in a policy realm around how do we deal with climate change, but what we're really not, what we're kind of ignoring.
That's a really, Kim, that's a really a great point. I mean, I think that the example actually of the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, I think is an amazing example of what we can do when we feel, when somebody decides or realizes that something is really dramatic. I wonder whether we can't have some kind of shift to be doing something over a very rapid time frame rather than the traditional, historical forever process. I mean, really takes a long time to make policy changes historically. I wonder if now the fact that we can see that we have seen that we can do something in a much more rapid time scale, if that might light a fire somewhere, to use an expression. Let's see, many students, or Stacy says, many students are passionate about social justice. This is an avenue to deepen their understanding and a critical eye towards the data presented as evidence, one way or the other, to make policy decisions. So I think that those two things are linked. It's part of the discussion. Good, those things can make it real. Thanks, Derek. They also make students more likely to get involved. Yeah, taking a neutral stance, they are actually taking a stance that perpetuates social and environmental inequities. Agreed. But then I think that that's absolutely true. Thank you. All right, so we just have a few minutes left. I want to point out that there's a variety of assessment opportunities built into this unit, and you and your team at your school will make some decisions about which of these would be most or best suited to your situation. Some things actually have different parts, and so different parts of different assignments could be used to assess different standards. And I just will say, I'm sure that you notice that there are no tests here, right? In distance learning, we really have to expand our view about what an assessment actually is. And also, I think, reframe our understanding of what sufficient evidence is. When students are only given one type of assessment to accomplish, and then their whole grade on a unit or on a topic is assessed by a single thing, and it's only one type of assessment, that actually dramatically limits the ability of some students to show evidence of understanding. So when we provide different kinds of assessment opportunities, we are actually giving them more chance at success. And it connects also with those parts about what do they feel passionate about, what do they connect with, and gives them a little bit more flexibility. So you'll also notice that there are some standards that have more opportunities than others, and that's just kind of the nature of the time frame that we're dealing with right now. And I encourage you to work with your school team to figure out what's going to work best for you. There are some other supports involved or that we have available for you. The INB and the Canvas shell are not there yet, but they will be by the end of this week coming up. I'm curious if any of you are using the paper packet, will you please send me an email? We've not gotten a lot of feedback about use of the paper packet, and so we've kind of dropped off on building that because we don't want to spend a lot of time on building something that nobody is using. So if you're using the paper packet, could you let me know, please? That would be really helpful feedback. I think that most, if not all of you already have access to the teachers only folder for patterns biology, but if you don't, you can fill out the form that's at this link, bit.ly/teachers only patterns. That will allow you to have access to the teachers only folder. It has lots of stuff from the in-person course, tests, and more traditional assessments, but we also put student exemplars in there when we have them, when we're, of course, for these new tasks, adding those student exemplars as we go. So it is 10 o'clock. I want to give you the opportunity to go ahead and go if you need to go. I understand everybody has other things to do with their Sunday, but if you'd like to stay and ask some questions, I'll be happy to entertain those. Thank you so much.